a gladiator, a rebel, a vessel of wrath!
Rome stood tall, crowned in marble and blood. Above the world, senators debated philosophy, generals drank wine, and emperors praised the gods for their endless victories. The empire called itself eternal, unbreakable, chosen. But Rome's greatness was built on something buried far below its streets: chains. Beneath the stone roads and towering arenas, beneath the cheers of the Colosseum, millions of slaves breathed dust and despair. Their backs were scarred, their names erased, their prayers unanswered. At least, that is what Rome believed. At night, when the torches dimmed and the city slept, the ground itself seemed to groan. In the dark tunnels where slaves were kept, whispers traveled through the walls, old words in older tongues. Not Latin, not Greek, something far more ancient. The elders among the slaves warned them in hushed voices. Before Rome had gods, other gods ruled here. Gods not of order or law, but of chains, war, and vengeance. Rome had conquered them long ago, their temples torn down, their names forbidden, their idols shattered and buried beneath stone and silence. The priests said they were dead, but gods do not die so easily. They wait. Every crack of a whip was remembered, every scream soaked into the earth, every drop of blood fed something hungry below. In the gladiator barracks, men trained to kill for entertainment, slaves forced to fight slaves while Rome applauded. The sand drank deeply, too deeply. Some nights the sand felt warm, even before the blood was spilled. One slave, new, silent, dangerous, began to dream. He saw chains snapping like bones. He saw Rome burning under a blackened sky, and in the fire stood towering figures with hollow eyes and iron crowns. They were watching him. Rome believed fear kept its empire alive, but fear had roots, and beneath the empire, something ancient was stirring, not for Rome, but against it. The chains were beginning to remember what they were made for. Freedom always demands a price, and the gods were ready to collect. He was called Spartacus, a name whispered with fear and hope in equal measure. To Rome, he was just another gladiator, a slave forged in iron and fire, trained to kill for sport, stripped of his past and shackled in his chains. But even among the broken, Spartacus was different. He carried himself not like a man beaten, but like a storm waiting to strike. Every step echoed strength, every glare promised defiance. And at night, in the darkness of the barracks, his dreams were unlike those of others. He dreamed of blood raining from the sky. He dreamed of a warhammer, ancient and blackened, engraved with runes older than Rome itself. It called to him, not with words but with a hunger he could feel in his bones. When he reached out, his fingers brushed the cold iron and the world shifted. The shadows around him stretched unnaturally. Whispers filled his ears, deep voices that carried the weight of centuries. "We are here," they said. "The chains that bound us now bind the world." Spartacus awoke drenched in sweat, the whispers fading but leaving a scar on his mind. He could not tell if it was prophecy or madness, but something within him stirred. A fire Rome had never lit and never could extinguish. In the arena he fought as usual. The crowd roared. Spears, swords, and the cruel glee of men eager for death surrounded him. But Spartacus no longer fought for survival alone. Every swing of his blade, every deflection of steel felt guided, as if an invisible hand shaped the battle. A fellow gladiator whispered, half in awe, half in fear, "It's like he's not just fighting, he's commanding the sand itself." And deep in the empire's veins, beneath stone and blood, the old gods listened. The chains that had held their power dormant trembled. Rome's greatest fear was not the revolt they could see, but the one awakening beneath it. The hammer had chosen its bearer, and Spartacus was beginning to answer. The chains would not remain unbroken for long. Long before Rome ever dreamed of power, before its legions marched across the world, there were gods who ruled, not from marble temples but from shadows, from the earth itself. They were not gods of mercy or light. They were gods of chains, blood, and war. They fed on suffering. They whispered to those enslaved, to those crushed beneath empires yet to rise. They demanded obedience, and in return, they gave power. But Rome, in its arrogance, believed it could command eternity. It tore down their temples, shattered their idols, and etched their names into oblivion. Priests burned their scriptures. Kings and emperors thought they had exiled these gods into nothingness. They were wrong. The gods were not destroyed. They were buried. Beneath the stones of the empire. Beneath the fields Rome conquered. Beneath the screams of those who labored and died unseen. And they waited. Now, centuries later, Rome's chains creaked under the weight of rebellion. Spartacus rose, unaware that the hammer he sought in his dreams had been forged by these very gods, shaped to awaken their wrath. The whispers in his sleep were not his own mind. They were the gods calling, stirring the blood of slaves and rulers alike. One night, as the city slept under torchlight, a tremor ran through the soil. Slaves in the barracks shivered as if the earth itself exhaled. The old chains, the ones that bound the gods to their hidden tombs, rattled faintly. The gods remembered their names. The gods remembered their power. The gods remembered Rome. And in the shadows of the empire they stirred. The ancient war gods, long thought dead, hungered once more. And they would not rest until chains were broken, and Rome had paid the price. The arena was silent, though the city roared above. Torches flickered, casting long shadows that danced like the spirits of the damned. Spartacus stood in the sand, his eyes sharp, his breath steady. Around him, the gladiators prepared for the fight. Rome's entertainment, its blood-soaked spectacle. But this night would be different. The first strike of the sword, the first scream, the first drop of blood that hit the sand, it was not just spilled for sport. It was an offering. A tremor ran through the arena floor, so faint that no Roman senator noticed. But those attuned to the whispers, the slaves, the condemned, felt it like a heartbeat beneath their feet. Spartacus fought with a precision no mortal should possess. Every swing, every parry, every strike of his blade felt guided by something older, darker, hungrier. The spectators cheered, unaware that with each cheer, with each drop of blood, the chains that bound the old gods weakened. From the shadows beneath the arena, unseen hands seemed to rake through the earth. The gods stirred. The war hammer appeared in his dreams once again, black and heavy, thirsting for more. The first victim fell and the ground drank deeply. A whisper filled the barracks. The chains break. The blood calls. Spartacus felt it. Not fear, not shame, but power. The taste of it on his tongue was intoxicating, dangerous. He was no longer just a man or a gladiator. He was a signal, a beacon for forces Rome had long tried to bury. By dawn, whispers had become a chorus. Across the empire, the air seemed heavier, as if unseen eyes watched, waited, hungered. The first blood offering had been made, and the gods were awakening. The rebellion had begun, but the true war was only starting. The war hammer was no ordinary weapon. It lay in the shadows of Spartacus' dreams, blackened and etched with runes older than Rome itself. Now it called to him with a voice only he could hear. At first it was a whisper. Soft, insistent, like wind brushing over iron chains. Strike, break, obey. When Spartacus held it in his hands, the weight was heavier than any weapon he had ever lifted. Yet he felt no strain. Every swing of the hammer resonated with something beyond muscle, beyond skill, something ancient, relentless, divine. In the arena he struck again. The blows were unlike any mortal fighting. Sand flew, shields shattered, and men fell in ways that defied the natural order. The crowd gasped, sensing an almost supernatural power in his movements, though they could not name it. And then he heard it, the hammer speaking clearly in his mind, showing visions. Cities burning. Rome's legions torn asunder. Chains breaking, not just of iron, but of fate itself. The gods, long dormant, rising from their graves beneath the empire. We are hungry. We chose you, Spartacus. Will you feed us? A chill ran down his spine. The power was intoxicating and yet terrifying. He realized the revolt was no longer his alone. He was a vessel, a conduit for something far older, far darker than the ambitions of man. When he swung the hammer, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Soldiers fled before him as if the weapon carried the wrath of gods, not men. The line between rebellion and apocalypse blurred. The old gods were awakening through him, and their hunger would not be sated with mere chains and slaves. The hammer spoke, and Spartacus listened. Rome had seen many things: barbarian hordes, civil wars, plagues, and uprisings. Yet none of these had shaken its pride like the whispers now crawling through the streets and the shadows. Rumors spread like wildfire, strange happenings in the gladiator barracks, slaves vanishing, soldiers trembling without reason. Something unnatural was afoot. Generals met behind closed doors in the marble halls of the Palatine, faces pale, eyes darting. "We have faced Spartacus," one said. "But this is not a man." The other shook his head. "A man does not command the sand to rise against him. A man does not strike and leave men shattered in ways the mind cannot comprehend. This is something else." Priests scurried through the city, chanting protective verses, sprinkling sacred oils, and calling upon Jupiter, Mars, and all the gods Rome revered. But the old gods, forgotten by Rome centuries ago, were not so easily dismissed. The earth beneath the empire pulsed with anger, and the blood spilled in the arena had fed their awakening. That night, even the city itself seemed alive with fear. Torches flickered in the windless streets. Rats scuttled in patterns that no sane eye could follow. Slaves whispered to each other in terror, seeing shadows move where there should be none. Soldiers, sworn to obedience, found themselves hesitating in their duties, paralyzed by a dread they could not name. Spartacus became more than a name. He became a legend whispered in fear, a shadow in the minds of men. Rome's greatest fear was not his rebellion. It was the unseen power that moved through him, the invisible hand of the old gods guiding each strike of the war hammer, each rallying cry to the oppressed, each act of defiance that tore at the empire's foundations. And then came the visions. The generals, the senators, even the common citizens who dared to gaze upon the bloody battlefield began to dream. Nightmares of fire raining from the sky, of statues crying blood, of titanic shadows rising from the earth itself. Rome's soldiers awoke screaming, Rome's senators trembled in their marble halls, and Rome's priests clutched at scrolls that promised protection but could no longer hold back the tide. Spartacus' revolt was no longer just a threat. It was an omen. The gods Rome had buried were rising. The empire's arrogance, its pride, its belief in eternal dominion, was cracking under the weight of ancient wrath. And as Rome slept uneasily in the dark, one question haunted them all. What walks the night when the chains of the past are broken? The answer was coming. Rome knew fear. And it was only the beginning. The streets of Rome no longer belonged to Rome. The cries of slaves and the clash of rebellion echoed through marble corridors, across the forums and into the heart of the empire. Spartacus had become more than a man. He had become a symbol, a herald of something ancient, something that fed on chains and blood. Every slave who raised a fist, every man who broke free from his shackles, every drop of blood spilled in defiance, it all whispered to the old gods buried beneath Rome. They stirred with hunger and purpose, their power flowing into the rebellion like a tide swelling in a storm. Spartacus walked among his people, the warhammer always at his side, a dark shadow against the firelight. His eyes held the calm certainty of one chosen not just to lead men, but to awaken powers Rome thought dead. The hammer pulsed with life in his hands. Each swing, each strike against his oppressors, was a song of chains breaking, a hymn to vengeance. And as the gods flowed through him, the line between mortal and divine blurred. Spartacus no longer felt the weight of fear, of doubt, or of human limitation. He climbed the steps of conquered temples, raising his hand in silent command. Slaves followed him, eyes wide with hope, hearts pounding with new strength. Crowns were not given, they were taken. And Spartacus, born of chains, became the crown of rebellion. Rome's soldiers, once disciplined and unyielding, began to falter. They saw not just a man, but a storm of wrath that seemed to bend reality itself. Some whispered in terror, "He is no longer human, the gods themselves walk with him." And they were not entirely wrong. The war gods that Rome had buried centuries ago had found their champion, their conduit, their vessel. Through Spartacus, chains became more than instruments of oppression. They became symbols of power, of fear, of destiny rewritten. By the fires of conquered towns, whispers grew into chants. "Spartacus, Spartacus." The slaves no longer whispered in fear, they shouted in defiance. And the gods smiled in the shadows, feeding on the chaos, growing stronger with every crown stolen from Rome's arrogance. The chains that bound men had transformed into the crowns of kings, dark kings chosen by gods long forgotten. Rome, for the first time in centuries, understood the truth. The empire could not contain this power. Spartacus had become a force beyond rebellion, beyond humanity, and the gods were only beginning to show their teeth. Spartacus had felt the power coursing through him, the whispers of the old gods guiding each swing of the warhammer, each rallying cry to the enslaved, each act of defiance against Rome. He had become a living storm, a symbol of vengeance, a dark king crowned by the chains of the oppressed. But power, especially the power of gods long buried, comes at a cost few mortals can bear. At first it was subtle. Dreams grew darker, filled with visions not of Rome, not of battle, but of towering figures with hollow eyes, their bodies veiled in shadows, their hands outstretched, demanding obedience. The voices were no longer whispers, they were commands. Strike harder. Spill more blood. Obey or the chains will bind you instead. Spartacus hesitated. For the first time he felt a flicker of fear, not for himself but for those he led. He had not risen to destroy but to free. And yet the god's influence was growing, insistent, consuming. Each victory in battle seemed to bring not liberation but corruption. Cities burned, yes, but innocent blood spilled as well. Families, children, entire villages caught in the storm of divine wrath. He tried to resist, tried to ignore their whispers, tried to focus on the cause he believed in. But the gods were patient, ancient, and infinitely cunning. The war hammer, once a tool, now pressed against him like a living weight. It thrummed with hunger. It called him, threatened him, demanded obedience. One night, in the quiet of a conquered town, Spartacus dropped to his knees. Sweat and blood mixed on his skin. The gods appeared, not in form but in essence, a storm of shadows and fire that filled the air, making the walls of the town tremble. Their voices boomed inside his mind. We chose you, Spartacus. You carry our chains, our vengeance. You are our instrument. Obey. He clenched his fists, trying to shut them out, to remind himself of humanity, of mercy. But the gods did not bend. Their hunger for chaos and blood was infinite, and they were done waiting. Do you deny us? The hammer quivered in his hands as if alive, urging him to obey, to surrender, to become the agent of destruction they demanded. Every strike he had made, every victory he had won, had been only a fraction of what they required. Spartacus realized then the terrifying truth: he was never truly free. The rebellion, the rise of the oppressed, the fall of Rome, these had all been orchestrated not by human ambition, but by the gods' insatiable desire. He had been chosen not as a savior, but as a weapon. He looked upon his followers, their eyes filled with hope and trust, and the weight of betrayal pressed upon him. Could he turn against the gods? Could a mortal defy powers older than time itself? The gods' shadows stretched across the battlefield, crushing cities and armies alike. They whispered secrets of destruction, showing him visions of a world remade under their dominion, a world where men were no longer free, where chains ruled once more, but this time chains bound all. Spartacus raised the war hammer, but it felt heavier than ever. He knew what must be done: resist or be consumed. Yet resistance carried a price. The gods were relentless, omnipresent, and his very soul trembled under their gaze. If I obey, I destroy what I swore to protect. If I resist, I risk becoming nothing even before Rome falls. The first act of rebellion against the gods was not public. It was internal, a battle of will so fierce it shook the foundations of his mind. Shadows clawed at him, promising power and dominion, but Spartacus dug deep into the memory of those who had suffered chains, and the hope that had driven him from the very first day. He would not be their puppet. But as he lifted the hammer against the night sky, lightning crackling from the god's wrath, he understood the cruel paradox. He could resist, but he could not stop the chaos that had already begun. The empire burned, the innocent suffered, and the whispers of the gods continued, relentless, echoing through every heart and every mind. The gods had turned on their champion, not out of cruelty, but because power without hunger is meaningless. Spartacus was strong, yes, but even the strongest mortal is fragile when the divine hungers. And so he stood, alone in the heart of rebellion between Rome, his followers, and the insatiable will of ancient gods. The war hammer in his hands was both a blessing and a curse, a tool of liberation and destruction alike. The gods demand obedience, but Spartacus demands freedom. And the clash between the divine and mortal will was only beginning. Rome, eternal and unyielding, had believed itself invincible. For centuries, it had conquered, enslaved, and ruled, convinced that the favor of its gods and the might of its legions would never fail. Yet the foundations of its power, built on blood and fear, were brittle. The whispers of the past had never died, they had only waited. The rebellion had spread like wildfire. From the arenas to the streets, from the fields to the temples, the oppressed rose. Slaves, once silent and invisible, now roared in unison. Chains clattered not as instruments of bondage but as symbols of revolt, each link a promise that Rome's arrogance would no longer hold. At the heart of this storm stood Spartacus. The war hammer in his hands thrummed with divine energy, pulsating in rhythm with the hunger of the gods who had chosen him. He had resisted them, yes, but their power had already reshaped the world. Cities burned, armies shattered, and the empire trembled. The gods, long buried beneath Rome, now walked openly through shadows and fire. Titans of rage and vengeance, they towered above the collapsing streets, eyes hollow yet burning with ancient fury. They had aided Spartacus, empowered him, but even their allegiance was not loyalty, it was appetite. They demanded destruction, and they were not yet satisfied. The final battle was not fought with strategy or numbers, but with fear, blood, and the raw weight of divine wrath. Spartacus led his army, not merely of men, but of terror incarnate, as each step echoed with the cries of gods awakened. Rome's legions tried to form lines, tried to resist, but even their discipline faltered. The shadows of the ancient gods twisted the air, making shields splinter and swords turn heavy as lead. Above the chaos, Spartacus raised the war hammer, and the ground itself cracked under its weight. Flames erupted from streets and temples alike, a signal to the empire that the chains it had relied on for centuries were breaking. And the slaves, the crownless kings of their own fate, marched, shouted, and charged with an unstoppable force, carrying the hope of centuries and the wrath of forgotten gods. Yet victory was not simple. The gods' hunger was insatiable. Where Spartacus sought freedom, they sought devastation. Innocent and guilty alike fell before their wrath. Entire districts were swallowed by fire. The line between liberation and annihilation blurred. Spartacus realized with a painful clarity that to defy the gods was not only to risk his life, but to risk the very lives of those he had vowed to save. The city burned, the screams of Rome mingling with the chants of the oppressed. Priests fell to their knees, pleading with Jupiter and Mars, but no god answered. Only the forgotten deities, hungry and ancient, strode through the ruins, their chains rattling like the beat of war drums. And then, in a moment that would be etched into the echoes of history, Spartacus stood alone on the steps of the Capitol. His body was bloodied, his hands raw, his mind teetering between mortal exhaustion and divine possession. The gods towered above him, demanding obedience. The empire beneath him groaned in fear. He raised the hammer once more, and with a scream that carried the pain of centuries, the rebellion's fury, and the defiance of humanity, he struck. The gods recoiled, not defeated, but stalled. The city shook, the walls of Rome splintered, and the chains of oppression shattered. Rome had not fallen in a single night. It had fallen in whispers, in screams, in the slow, relentless breaking of chains. And though the empire survived in structure, it would never survive in spirit. The gods, ancient and patient, returned to their slumber, but their hunger remained, and the memory of their wrath lingered in every shadow, every alley, every stone. Spartacus, the man in iron, the bearer of the war hammer, had won the battle but not the war against the divine. He had freed men, yes, but the gods had left their mark upon the world, and the story of Rome's fall had been written not in marble, not in law, but in chains, blood, and fire. Chains that once bound men had become crowns of defiance. The gods had awakened. The empire had trembled. And history would never forget the night Rome learned fear. And as the dust settled, the shadows whispered once more. The chains will rise again. The gods never sleep. And the blood of men will always call to them.